Close your eyes for a moment and think about the word voodoo. What do you see? Probably a dark room, candles, a doll with pins stuck through it, a sinister figure muttering curses over a bubbling pot, a religion of black magic, death, and fear. That is the image that Hollywood burned into the collective imagination of the Western world over more than a century of horror films, sensational novels, and deliberate propaganda. It is vivid, it is powerful, and it is almost entirely wrong. The real story of voodoo, or Vodou, as its practitioners spell it, is one of the most extraordinary and most deliberately buried stories in all of human history. It is a story of a sophisticated spiritual and medical tradition developed over thousands of years in West Africa, carried across the ocean in the bodies and minds of enslaved people who had nothing left but their faith, misunderstood and weaponized by the very civilization that was simultaneously stealing its core practices and passing them off as European medicine. Yes, you heard that correctly. The healing practices at the heart of Vodou appeared in England, were used by English physicians, were celebrated as medical breakthroughs, and the people who originated them were called savages and devil worshippers. This is that story. To understand what Vodou truly is, you need to travel back at least 1,000 years to the kingdoms of West Africa, particularly the Fan and Yu peoples of what is today Benin, Togo, and Ghana. Here, in sophisticated and highly organized societies with rich philosophical and spiritual traditions, Vodou was not a dark cult. It was a complete worldview. The word Vodou itself comes from the Fan language and means simply spirit or divine force. Vodou taught that the universe was alive with spiritual energy, that there were powerful divine beings called Loa who served as intermediaries between the supreme creator God and humanity. Each Loa governed a specific domain of human life: health, love, death, agriculture, the sea, and crucially for our story, healing. The Vodou tradition placed enormous importance on the relationship between the spiritual and the physical body. Illness was understood not merely as a physical malfunction but as a disruption of spiritual balance. And the healers within Vodou communities, the Hungans and Mambos, the priests and priestesses, were not witch doctors in the Hollywood sense. They were sophisticated practitioners who combined deep spiritual knowledge with an extraordinarily detailed understanding of medicinal plants, healing herbs, and what we would today recognize as psychological and community-based therapy. Their knowledge had been built and refined over centuries. It was a medical tradition in the truest sense, and it worked. Then came the ships. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 12 million African people were torn from their homes, chained in the holds of slave vessels, and transported across the Atlantic in conditions of almost unimaginable horror. The Middle Passage, as the slave traders clinically called it, killed somewhere between 1 and 2 million people before they ever reached the Americas. Those who survived arrived in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in North America, stripped of their names, their languages, their families, and their legal status as human beings. But there was one thing that could not be chained, could not be confiscated at the dock, could not be beaten out of a person no matter how hard the overseer tried: the knowledge that lived inside the mind, the faith that lived inside the spirit. The Vodou tradition traveled across the ocean in the memories and hearts of enslaved West Africans, and it did not merely survive the crossing. It adapted, transformed, and grew stronger under pressure. In Haiti, then the French colony of Saint-Domingue, Vodou merged with elements of French Catholicism to create the rich and complex tradition we recognize today. The Loa were given the faces of Catholic saints as protective camouflage. Sacred ceremonies were held in secret, and the healing knowledge, the extraordinary pharmacological and spiritual medical practice at the heart of Vodou, continued to be practiced in the shadows, keeping enslaved communities alive when European medicine either ignored them or actively harmed them. Now here is where the story takes its most extraordinary and most infuriating turn. While Vodou was being practiced in secret in the shadow of plantation houses, while its practitioners were being labeled savages and devil worshippers by the very civilization enslaving them, that same civilization was quietly, systematically, and without acknowledgement borrowing its medical knowledge. The story of how Vodou healing practices reached England is not one single dramatic moment. It is a pattern, a long, repeated pattern of European physicians and naturalists traveling to the Caribbean and the Americas, observing the healing practices of enslaved Africans and indigenous people, and returning home with new medical knowledge that they presented as their own discoveries. One of the most documented cases involves smallpox inoculation, one of the most important medical breakthroughs in European history. In 1721, a Boston minister named Cotton Mather described a method of smallpox inoculation that he had learned from an enslaved African man named Onesimus. Onesimus explained that this practice, deliberately introducing a small amount of smallpox material under the skin to produce immunity, was common knowledge in West Africa. It had been practiced there for generations. When this technique was brought to England and promoted by physicians there, it was celebrated as a triumph of European medicine. Onesimus received no credit. His entire civilization's medical tradition received no credit. The knowledge was taken, the source was erased, and this was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern repeated across botany, pharmacology, surgical technique, and the treatment of tropical diseases throughout the colonial period. So why, if Vodou healing knowledge was valuable enough to steal, was the tradition itself so aggressively demonized? The answer is as ugly as it is straightforward. Slavery required dehumanization to function. For the system of chattel slavery to be morally sustainable, or at least morally survivable, for the people profiting from it, it was necessary to believe that the enslaved were not fully human, that their cultures were primitive, that their spiritual traditions were not religion but superstition, not medicine but witchcraft. A civilization sophisticated enough to have developed a working smallpox vaccine centuries before Europe could not be a primitive civilization. A spiritual tradition complex enough to sustain communities through the horrors of slavery could not be mere devil worship. And so the propaganda machine went to work. Colonial authorities banned Vodou ceremonies. Plantation owners punished practitioners. Missionaries described Vodou as satanic. And when Haiti, the only nation in history founded by a successful slave revolt, won its independence in 1804, the demonization intensified dramatically. European and American powers were terrified. A successful Black Revolution, powered in part by Vodou ceremony and Vodou community solidarity, was the most dangerous idea in the Atlantic world. Haiti was isolated, sanctioned, and forced to pay reparations to France for the property, meaning the people that the revolution had freed. And Vodou was painted as the dark force behind it all, primitive, dangerous, evil. The lie was useful, so the lie was told loudly, repeatedly, and for centuries. Let us be specific. Because the connection between Vodou healing practice and legitimate medicine is not speculation, it is documented historical record. The pharmacological knowledge embedded in Vodou tradition was genuinely advanced. Vodou healers had developed effective treatments for fever, infection, pain, and mental illness centuries before European medicine reached equivalent approaches. The use of the Caribbean plant now known as Rauwolfia, used in Vodou healing to treat what practitioners described as spiritual disturbance, was eventually adopted by Western medicine in the 20th century as reserpine, one of the first effective treatments for hypertension and psychiatric conditions. The Vodou practice of using specific fungi and plant compounds to induce altered states for healing purposes prefigured modern psychedelic therapy by centuries. The communal and ceremonial aspects of Vodou healing, gathering the community, using rhythm and movement, creating powerful shared emotional experiences for the sick person, align remarkably closely with what modern psychology now recognizes as the therapeutic power of community, ritual, and the placebo effect properly understood. In the Vodou Pharmacopoeia, the catalog of medicinal plants used by Hungans and Mambos has been found by modern ethnobotanists to contain dozens of compounds with genuine and measurable medical efficacy. This was not witchcraft. This was medicine, ancient, sophisticated, effective medicine, and it was practiced by people that the Western world chose to call primitive. Today, Vodou is the official religion of Haiti, practiced openly and proudly by millions of people. It has been recognized by scholars, anthropologists, and increasingly by medical researchers as a sophisticated and valuable tradition deserving of serious study and genuine respect. The demonization has not disappeared. It flares up reliably every time Haiti suffers a disaster, with commentators still reaching for the lazy and racist shorthand of blaming voodoo for Haitian poverty, ignoring the very specific and very documentable role that French reparation demands, American occupation, and deliberate economic isolation played in creating that poverty. But the scholarly conversation has shifted. The work of anthropologists like Wade Davis, whose research into Vodou pharmacology produced genuine breakthroughs in understanding the compounds used by Vodou practitioners, has helped bring serious academic attention to what practitioners always knew. The healing knowledge was real. The spiritual tradition was sophisticated. The demonization was a political weapon, not a moral judgment. And the theft, the quiet, unacknowledged borrowing of African medical knowledge by European physicians who then denied its origins, is now a recognized and documented chapter in the history of medicine. Justice in history rarely arrives cleanly or completely, but sometimes the truth, patient and persistent as a medicinal root growing through stone, finds its way to the surface. Vodou waited 300 years for the world to stop lying about it. The wait, it seems, is finally ending. And there it is, a tradition thousands of years old, stolen from, lied about, weaponized against the very people who built it, and still standing, still healing, still here. That is perhaps the most powerful thing history can teach us, that the truth, no matter how long it is buried, has a way of finding the light eventually. If this story opened your eyes or made you see something differently, please hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling the stories that the history books forgot to include. And now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what history subject are you most curious about? A forgotten civilization, a buried truth, a figure history got completely wrong? Write it down below, because our next video might be built entirely around your idea. Every story starts with someone brave enough to ask the question. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter. Until then, keep questioning everything. The most important truths are almost always the ones someone worked very hard to hide.